By the time the week drew to a close, Easton City had become a microcosm of public debate, media scrutiny, and civic reflection. The incident with Bradley Harkins dominating headlines, trending hashtags, and television segments, while inside the police department, the atmosphere was electric with tension, anxiety, and whispered speculation. Officers walking the hallways in muted awe or fearful anticipation as the consequences of unchecked arrogance and racial bias were brought into sharp relief, and Bradley, pale and visibly worn from sleepless nights, endless internal meetings, and the gnawing pressure of impending disciplinary action, was called into the final series of hearings where Darius Cole, seated with impeccable poise, presented the culmination of his methodical investigation with clarity and precision that left no room for argument or manipulation, meticulously walking through body cam footage, witness statements, digital records, procedural violations, and patterns of prior misconduct, each piece connecting seamlessly to reveal not a single moment of doubt regarding Bradley's behavior. While the room packed with city officials, union representatives, journalists, and members of the public observed in rapt silence as Darius articulated the principles of accountability, ethics, and impartial justice, his voice calm yet commanding, every word resonating with authority that even the most skeptical listener could not ignore. And as Bradley attempted feeble explanations, defensive remarks, and half-hearted apologies, his arguments collapsed under the weight of indisputable evidence, each testimony, video clip, and documented procedure creating an irrefutable narrative of misconduct. And as the final deliberations began, it became apparent to everyone present that the consequences would be severe and lasting, with disciplinary measures, mandatory retraining, suspension, and public censure being just the first layer of accountability. While the media outside chronicled every moment, live streaming, posting updates, conducting interviews, and analyzing each segment of the hearing to ensure that the public could witness justice in action, and social media continued to buzz with commentary, analysis, and debate, a national conversation on racial bias, ethical policing, and institutional accountability thriving on the digital platforms. While Bradley, realizing fully the extent of his downfall, sat silently, the enormity of his actions and their consequences crashing upon him like a tidal wave, and every attempt to rationalize, excuse, or manipulate the outcome now meaningless. His career, reputation, and personal life all teetering on the edge of irrevocable damage, while Darius, methodical and composed as ever, coordinated the post-hearing process with legal teams, department leadership, and media liaisons, ensuring that all procedural requirements were met, that transparency was maintained, and that the incident served as a lasting lesson, both internally within the police force and externally to the public, about the standards expected of those entrusted with authority. And as the final public statement was issued, reiterating the department's commitment to integrity, accountability, and equitable enforcement of the law, the narrative began to shift from scandal to resolution, highlighting the importance of ethical conduct, oversight, and the consequences of misconduct, while Bradley now facing formal suspension, mandatory retraining, and a permanent mark on his record, slowly confronted the reality that his actions had irreversibly altered the trajectory of his life, a lesson in humility, accountability, and the collapse of ego under scrutiny. And as days passed, the department adjusted to the precedent set by the case, officers observing a renewed emphasis on procedure, impartiality, and ethical decision-making, internal policies being reviewed, training programs updated, and culture slowly shifting to reflect a greater commitment to fairness and accountability. While Darius Cole, having navigated the entire investigation with precision, integrity, and foresight, continued to oversee reforms, mentoring officers, ensuring that lessons from the incident were institutionalized, and maintaining public confidence in the department's ability to self-correct. And as the city absorbed the conclusion of the saga, the public discourse moved from outrage to reflection, discussions on systemic change, ethical policing, and community engagement becoming central topics in forums, town halls, and digital platforms, while Bradley, isolated and chastened, confronted the personal cost of his actions, the collapse of privilege and unchecked power, and the impact of a single moment of bias that had escalated into a transformative event. Ultimately understanding that authority is not a shield against accountability, and that integrity, preparation, and respect for the law are the foundations upon which true power rests. And as night fell over Easton City, with lights flickering, in office buildings, homes, and police precincts alike, the echoes of the incident remained, a testament to the consequences of misconduct, the resilience of ethical oversight, and the enduring authority of a man like Darius Cole, whose calm, methodical, and principled approach had not only enforced justice in one high-profile case, but had also reshaped the culture of the department, leaving a legacy that would influence the city, its police force, and its citizens for years to come. And as Bradley walked home from the courthouse steps, head bowed, shoulders slumped, and the weight of reality pressing down upon him, he realized that in the intricate balance between power, accountability, and integrity, there is no room for arrogance, bias, or misjudgment, and that the full measure of authority is found not in fear, its dominance, or unchecked privilege, but in the careful, deliberate, and principled exercise of responsibility, a lesson now etched indelibly into the fabric of his life, the life of his colleagues, and the conscience of a city that had witnessed, in real time, both the collapse of misconduct and the triumph of ethical oversight, while Darius, standing outside the courthouse, observing the city pulse with life, knowing the work was far from over, but reassured that a powerful precedent had been set, allowed himself a quiet moment of satisfaction, fully aware that justice, methodical and unwavering, had prevailed, and that the story of a racist officer stopped in his tracks by the calm authority of the head of internal affairs would resonate for years as a reminder that no badge, no rank, and no personal bias could withstand the relentless force of truth, accountability, and integrity. As the city woke to another day of relentless news coverage, the headlines screaming across television screens, online portals, and social media feeds, Bradley Harkins felt the full, suffocating weight of public scrutiny pressing against him. Like an invisible wall, each notification on his phone, every ping of a new email or message from colleagues and superiors acting as a relentless reminder that his world, once so stable and self-assured, was now unraveling at dizzying speed. And the early morning sunlight that spilled across his apartment offered no comfort, only highlighting the sweat-stained suits, disheveled papers, and mounting evidence of his frantic attempts to manipulate perception, to smooth over the consequences of a single, fateful traffic stop, which had exploded into a media storm and a full-scale departmental crisis, the likes of which Easton City had not seen in decades. As DariusCole.com and methodical, orchestrated each step of the internal investigation with precision that made Bradley's frantic scrambling look amateurish. The head of internal affairs coordinating legal counsel, scheduling interviews with officers, witnesses, and supervisors, cross-referencing every piece of digital and physical evidence, and compiling a timeline so comprehensive that there was no room for doubt, no loophole for excuse. While outside, the public discourse reached fever pitch. News anchors debating racial bias in policing, community leaders demanding accountability, local politicians issuing carefully worded statements to show they were listening without compromising legal processes, and social media posts dissecting every angle, every word, every gesture from the viral videos. Hashtags trending nationally. Memes mocking Bradley's behavior, proliferating across platforms, all feeding back into the department, intensifying internal pressure. While Bradley, increasingly desperate, attempted to contact old allies, pleading with superiors for leniency, arranging private meetings with union representatives, even considering the morally dubious step of leveraging relationships and favors from past years. But every attempt only highlighted his lack of control, his panic evident in stammered phone calls, tense meetings, and increasingly erratic behavior that did not go unnoticed by colleagues and subordinates alike. And as he navigated these treacherous waters, he found himself confronting the very systems he had once used to shield himself, the rules, procedures, and chain of command he had taken for granted now looming as insurmountable barriers. While Darius, aware of every maneuver, anticipated Bradley's desperation, recording, documenting, and countering each move with quiet authority, ensuring that the investigation proceeded without interference, and that when hearings occurred, every aspect of Bradley's actions, every aggressive word, every violation of protocol, every biased decision would be laid bare in an unassailable, irrefutable case. And as the days bled into nights, the tension escalated, with Bradley attending one stressful meeting after another, each one eroding his composure, while Darius's team, meticulous and strategic, continued interviews, gathered statements, verified logs, reviewed body cam footage frame by frame, and meticulously compiled every element of the case into a report that was as comprehensive as it was damning. While outside, protesters gathered. Journalists broadcast live. City officials prepared statements for public consumption. And the story became a national conversation about accountability, racial bias, and the integrity of law enforcement. Leaving Bradley isolated, overwhelmed, and increasingly frantic, feeling the public, professional, and personal pressures converge like a storm. And as the hearing day approached, the air in the precinct thickened with anticipation. Whispers of "it's going to be tough and he won't get away with it this time" circulating among officers. While Darius, serene and calculating, reviewed the strategy with legal advisors, preparing questions, anticipating defense tactics, and ensuring the procedural integrity of the entire operation. Knowing that every detail mattered, that the outcome of this case would set a precedent, not just for Bradley, but for the entire force, demonstrating that rank, tenure, or arrogance could never shield misconduct from scrutiny. And as the morning of the hearings arrived, the courthouse steps were lined with journalists, cameras rolling, microphones pointed, live streams broadcasting every moment, while Bradley entered the building with a tight jaw and hollow gaze, aware that every misstep, every faltering answer, every defensive posture would be magnified, dissected, and remembered. And inside, Darius Cole, calm, collected, and authoritative, prepared to expose the full scope of misconduct, presenting evidence with precision, answering every question, methodically, and letting Bradley's own words, actions, and past behaviors speak for themselves, while the room, tense with anticipation, absorbed the drama unfolding in real time, the weight of justice, ethics, and accountability pressing down on everyone present, and his testimony, video evidence, and witness statements were methodically presented. Bradley's composure eroded further, the reality of impending consequences dawning with each new revelation, until by the afternoon, the hearing reached its climax, with Darius delivering the closing remarks, summarizing the evidence, highlighting patterns of misconduct, and leaving the room with an undeniable impression of integrity, authority, and righteousness, while Bradley, pale, trembling, and defeated, realized that no narrative, no plea, no attempt to evade responsibility could undo the damning reality laid before him. And as the proceedings concluded, the public, watching live or following news updates, had witnessed not just the fall of one officer, they had a powerful lesson in accountability. And as Bradley was escorted from the courthouse, the weight of his actions and the far-reaching consequences pressing down in ways he had never imagined, Darius remained poised, methodical, already planning the post-hearing protocols, media statements, and follow-up actions to ensure the integrity of the process, while the city, the department, and the nation absorbed the story, dissected it, debated it, and ultimately recognized that in moments like these, authority was measured not by intimidation, fear, or arrogance, but by calm, ethical, and unwavering adherence to the principles of justice, leaving Bradley to confront the reality that everything he had once relied upon, his badge, his privilege, his ego, had failed him, and that the reckoning had only just begun, with repercussions that would extend far beyond the walls of the courthouse, echoing through his career, his personal life, and the very institution he had once believed he could control, while Darius Cole, head of internal affairs, having orchestrated every step with quiet, unshakable authority, had not only ensured justice in this case, but also set a precedent that would ripple through the department for years, reshaping culture, expectations, and the boundaries of accountability in ways that were now undeniable and irrevocable. And as the day faded into night, the media continued its coverage. The city continued to buzz with conversation, and Bradley, alone and contemplative, realized fully, viscerally, that the choices he had made, the prejudice he had harbored, on the abuse of authority he had exercised, had culminated in a moment of profound public and personal reckoning, from which there was no escape, while Darius, calm and resolute, prepared for the next steps in ensuring that this story, this lesson, would endure, demonstrating that integrity, preparation, and authority grounded in truth were far stronger than fear, ego, or unchecked power, and that in the end, justice, slow but inevitable, always finds a way. By the time the morning sun filtered weakly through the blinds of Bradley Harkin's small, cluttered apartment, he had already replayed the incident 100 times in his head, each iteration twisting the events into a darker, more desperate reality where the consequences seemed to multiply exponentially with every thought. As he paced the narrow space, muttering fragments of excuses to himself that sounded hollow even in the echoing silence, wondering how he could explain to his family, his peers, or the union the magnitude of the embarrassment and legal jeopardy he now faced, while simultaneously knowing that no story, no fabricated account, could undo the meticulous documentation Darius Cole had already compiled, including timestamps, body cam footage from surrounding units, witness video clips that had gone viral overnight, and the hundreds of social media posts already buzzing with outrage, analysis and memes that painted Bradley as the epitome of unchecked privilege and racial bias, all of which made his skin crawl, his stomach knot, and his normally self-assured demeanor collapse into frantic anxiety, prompting him to call colleagues, some sympathetic, others reluctant, trying to piece together a narrative that might reduce the inevitable disciplinary action, though he knew deep down that every call, every whispered conversation, every attempt to manipulate the story was only adding to the evidence that Darius would leverage with surgical precision. While across the city, the Internal Affairs Office buzzed with a different kind of intensity. Darius, moving from one secure office to another, briefing legal advisors, reviewing procedural manuals, and meticulously planning interviews with witnesses, department leadership, and even city officials to ensure that no detail, no shred of evidence, no potential loophole could allow misconduct to go unpunished. In every action Darius took, measured and deliberate, contrasted sharply with Bradley's frantic scrambling, highlighting the stark difference between someone operating with authority, clarity, and patience, and someone blinded by panic, ego, and fear as the media continued to escalate the story. Reporters camping outside precincts, publishing live updates, analyzing body language, scrutinizing prior records, digging through internal complaints and personnel files to uncover a history of behavior that would contextualize the incident. While local activists organized demonstrations, online petitions demanding accountability, and community leaders weighed in publicly, forcing police administrators to respond with carefully worded statements that acknowledged the incident without compromising ongoing investigations. And all of this external pressure pressed against Bradley like a vice, constricting his ability to think rationally, while Darius, methodical and composed, moved deliberately through the storm, leveraging public scrutiny not as a tool of humiliation, but as a means to reinforce systemic accountability, ensuring that every procedural step, every recommendation, every potential disciplinary action was documented and defensible, creating a blueprint for a culture change that reached beyond Bradley himself, even as Bradley, isolated, cornered, and frantic, began to feel the true weight of his actions in the form of sleepless nights, tense interactions with colleagues who had begun to distance themselves, the cold shoulder of union representatives who were calculating risk versus loyalty, and the creeping fear that his personal life, relationships, financial stability, reputation could unravel at any moment. And as the days stretched into nights filled with news coverage, viral video analysis, and social media debates that dissected every second of the traffic stop, Bradley resorted to desperate measures, including back-channel calls to superiors, attempts to leverage past favors, and shallow displays of contrition, all of which Darius anticipated and logged, further strengthening the internal case and tightening the circle of accountability around him. While Darius's team interviewed witnesses, cross-referenced statements, collected digital evidence, and built a timeline that left no room for ambiguity, framing the incident not as a minor misstep but as a clear breach of protocol, abuse of authority, and a stark illustration of systemic problems that the department had to address. And even as Bradley scrambled to maintain control, the city council began discussing the incident publicly. Journalists prepared in-depth investigative pieces, and community leaders scheduled town hall meetings to address policing practices, ensuring that the narrative would not be confined to internal hearings, but would resonate throughout the community and the nation. While Bradley's attempts to manage his social media footprint, delete incriminating posts, and sanitize online mentions proved futile in the face of screenshots, reposts, and the viral nature of modern news. And Darius, aware of every move, every attempt to obscure or manipulate, documented each action, anticipating the patterns of human desperation under pressure, while Bradley's colleagues and fellow officers, observing the unfolding storm, began whispering among themselves about accountability, ethics, the precarious balance of power within the department. Some quietly admiring Darius' calm authority, others fearing the precedent it set. And through it all, Darius remained unshaken, treating every interaction, every statement, every piece of evidence, as part of a larger puzzle that would culminate in not just the correction of one officer's misconduct, but in a reaffirmation of the principle that no badge granted immunity from scrutiny. And as Bradley's anxiety spiraled, leading him to uncharacteristic errors, the contrast between the methodical, composed authority of Darius and the panicked, faltering desperation of Bradley became ever clearer, each misstep recorded, each hesitation noted, and each attempt to reclaim control meticulously countered, so that by the end of the week, when formal hearings were scheduled, public statements issued, and the first media briefings held, Bradley Harkins was already on the defensive, fatigued and exposed, while Darius, standing firm, orchestrating each procedural step with the precision of a seasoned strategist, had already ensured that the entire incident would serve as a case study, a warning and a transformative moment for the department, leaving Bradley to confront the inescapable reality that no personal charm, no manipulation, no plea for leniency could undo the meticulous work of the head of internal affairs, whose calm, calculated, and morally unshakable approach had turned what began as a routine, racially biased traffic stop into a pivotal event that would reshape not only one officer's career, but the ethical landscape of the entire police force. And as the night descended once more over Easton City, the media lights still flickering outside precincts, social feeds buzzing with commentary, and the public awaiting outcomes, Bradley sat alone in a small, dimly lit office, the weight of inevitability pressing down, realizing fully that every choice he had made, every abuse of authority, and every unexamined bias had led to this moment, while Darius, meticulous, calm, and in control, prepared the next steps with strategic patience, knowing that the storm had only begun, but that justice, methodical and thorough, would prevail, reshaping the city's understanding of power, accountability, the consequences of actions once thought to be beyond scrutiny. As soon as Darius Cole's words echoed through the afternoon air, announcing his position as head of internal affairs, the gathered crowd seemed to inhale sharply and then exhale collectively, their whispers and gasps creating a low hum that seemed to vibrate off the surrounding brick buildings. While Bradley Harkins, frozen for the first time in years by the sudden recognition of the magnitude of his mistake, felt the heat of embarrassment curl up from his chest into his neck and face, and though he tried to mask it with a fake scowl and a barked order for Darius to calm down, his voice wavered, The authority he usually wielded like a blunt instrument suddenly transformed into something fragile and brittle, as if it were made of cheap glass. And Darius, unflinching, maintained his composure, eyes scanning not just Bradley, but the surrounding street, the witnesses, the cameras now recording every second, the phones out. The bystanders whispering frantic questions about what was happening. And in that moment, it became clear that this was no ordinary traffic stop, no minor confrontation that could be buried in routine paperwork or ignored with a half-hearted apology. This was about power, accountability, and the sudden public unraveling of a man who had always believed himself untouchable. And Bradley's mind raced, replaying every aggressive word, every unnecessary push, every moment he had allowed his personal prejudices to guide his actions instead of the law he swore to uphold. And he could feel the weight of the cameras on him, the stares of his colleagues arriving on the scene, some shaking their heads, some trying not to laugh. The embarrassment solidifying into fear as a dispatcher called in an alert that would be broadcast through the precinct. All units, internal affairs is on site. Immediate compliance required, and suddenly the uniformed officers arriving seemed to part like a river around Darius. The respect for his position clear in the way they approached cautiously, while Bradley's hands, which had been confident just moments before, now fumbled with the paperwork, his badge, his radio, all tangible reminders that he had lost control. And Darius spoke again, calm, deliberate, commanding without raising his voice, explaining the protocols, reminding every officer present that misconduct would not be tolerated, that the behavior displayed moments ago could have legal, civil, and professional consequences, and as he did so, reporters who had already begun gathering at the periphery noticed the scene. Smartphones and cameras capturing the confrontation live, hashtags forming in real time across social media. The story spreading like wildfire with headlines such as "Racist Cop Confronted by IA Chief in Traffic Stop Turns into Public Shaming for Officer." And Bradley, realizing how quickly the narrative could spiral, tried to explain himself, fumbling over words, insisting it had been a routine stop, a misunderstanding. Anything to salvage the shreds of his reputation, but Darius, composed, strategic, allowed none of it to matter, simply documenting, observing, and letting Bradley's own actions speak louder than any excuse. All while the witness crowd murmured, some stepping forward to recount their observations, their accounts already being shared online, creating videos that would be dissected by viewers across the country, and internally, the police department felt the quake of inevitability, the whispers spreading from precinct to precinct, the union members bracing for fallout, the chief of police already drafting emergency memos to mitigate damage. All the while, Bradley's panic deepened as he realized that disciplinary action, internal investigation, suspension, public apology, and even potential criminal charges were no longer distant possibilities but imminent realities. And Darius, aware of the storm he had triggered merely by asserting his presence and authority, began the process with meticulous care, noting officer names, badge numbers, timestamps, witness statements, video feeds, every small detail that Bradley had thought he could manipulate or ignore, knowing that when the report reached the highest levels, the clarity and precision of the evidence would leave no room for doubt. And as the afternoon stretched into evening, Bradley was escorted to a separate vehicle, still dazed, his mind replaying the stop repeatedly, while Darius returned to his own car, phone in hand, already contacting the legal team, the press liaison, and the city administration, ensuring that every angle was covered. The narrative framed accurately and justice, impartial and public, would be inevitable, while in the background, the city's social media lit up with a mixture of outrage, support, disbelief, and calls for systemic accountability. The story gaining traction not just locally but nationally, news outlets requesting statements, interviews, and footage, and Bradley, alone now in the back of the squad car, could only stare out the window as the sun dipped below the skyline, casting long shadows over the streets he had once patrolled with unquestioned authority. Realizing that everything he had built, every assumption of power, every unchallenged bias, every small act of intimidation, had just collapsed in a single moment, and Darius, preparing his report with cold efficiency, knew that this incident would become a case study, a public lesson in accountability, but also a private warning to those who believed the badge made them untouchable. And as night fell and city lights flickered on, illuminating the faces of onlookers still lingering at the scene, Bradley began to comprehend fully that his career, his reputation, and his freedom now depended entirely on the mercy of procedures he had ignored, and a man whose calm authority and strategic mind had just rewritten the rules of engagement for him and every officer in Easton City, while Darius, resolute, methodical, already planned the next steps, including interviews, hearings, and perhaps criminal referral, knowing that the truth once revealed was unstoppable and that this encounter, seemingly brief, would ripple through every corridor of power, shaking complacent officers and corrupt systems alike, leaving Bradley Harkins to confront the reality that in the universe of law and justice, no badge, no uniform, no arrogance could shield him from the consequences of his own actions. And as the night deepened and the city's hum softened into a distant murmur, the first seeds of reckoning had already been planted, their roots winding quietly through the heart of the department. And the storm that would engulf Bradley and test the integrity of every officer around him had only just begun. While Darius Cole, head of internal affairs, watched silently, knowing that in moments like this, power was not exercised through threats, intimidation, or fear, but through calm presence, methodical planning, and the unshakable authority of truth. And the narrative he was crafting in that evening of quiet control would echo for weeks, months, and perhaps years to come, setting a precedent that would be impossible to ignore. And as Bradley finally lowered his gaze, exhausted and shaken, he understood, in that heavy and sinking moment, that nothing about his life or career would ever be the same again, and that the consequences of a single traffic stop, fueled by bias and arrogance, could reverberate across the city in ways he had never imagined. It was late afternoon when the golden light of the sun slanted across the cracked sidewalks of Easton City, bouncing off car windshields and turning the dust in the air into glittering flecks, the kind of picturesque moment that could make the city look gentle and alive, if only one ignored the weight of its history and the shadows that lingered in its institutions. And Officer Bradley Harkins had no interest in beauty anyway, as he sat in his patrol car at the corner of Jefferson Avenue and 12th Street, chewing loudly on a stick of gum, his thick fingers drumming against the steering wheel while his eyes scanned the passing traffic, not with the careful precision of a law enforcer devoted to safety, but with the twitchy impatience of a man always on the hunt for someone who didn't belong, someone whose skin color or accent or car made him think they needed to be reminded of their place. Because for Bradley Harkins, policing wasn't about protecting, it was about control. And nothing gave him the buzz he craved more than flexing his badge against the kind of people he secretly despised, though he would never admit it out loud in a department already walking on eggshells after several scandals. As his eyes flickered lazily from one vehicle to the next, spotted it. A sleek black Mercedes pulling smoothly through the intersection, its paint so polished it looked like liquid ink beneath the sun, its tinted windows giving off that aura of quiet confidence. And in an instant Bradley's lip curled into a sneer, because he knew without needing to see more than a glimpse of the driver's hand on the wheel that it was a black man. The kind of man who drove better cars than he thought they deserved, the kind who made him feel small in ways he couldn't articulate, so he slapped on his sirens and pulled out, cutting through traffic with a grin already stretching across his face. And the Mercedes obediently slowed, pulling over near the curb, with a calmness that made Bradley's chest tighten. With irritation because he wanted nervousness, fear, an immediate sense of submission. But when he swaggered up to the driver's side window and saw the man inside, tall, broad-shouldered, wearing a perfectly tailored gray suit with a silk tie knotted just right, his skin a deep brown that seemed to glow beneath the sunlight, his expression composed with the faintest trace of curiosity rather than worry, Bradley felt his rehearsed dominance waver just a little, though he masked it with a bark, license and registration. Now, and the man responded in a voice so steady, so commanding in its quiet confidence, that it unsettled him. "Of course, officer. Though may I ask the reason for the stop?" And those words, respectful, yet direct. Pressed against Bradley's pride like sandpaper, because he hated being questioned. Hated when people assumed they had the right to hold him accountable, so he leaned in closer, letting the scent of the man's cologne, a rich, expensive fragrance he couldn't name, flood his senses as he muttered, "Don't you worry about the reason, just hand me your papers." And the man, whose name was Darius Cole, though Bradley didn't know it yet, gave the faintest of smiles before complying, sliding his documents into Bradley's hand with a precision that spoke of long habit, as if he'd been through this dance many times before and knew exactly how to move without losing dignity. But as Bradley took the license, his eyes scanning the name, he paused just long enough for suspicion to itch in the back of his skull, because something about it felt familiar, though he shoved the thought aside and said gruffly, "Step out of the vehicle," his voice carrying more hostility than procedure, and Darius tilted his head slightly as though weighing the demand. Before unlocking the door and stepping out with a presence that seemed to fill the air, his tall frame unfolding with the grace of someone who didn't merely stand, but commanded space, and pedestrians slowing on the sidewalk to watch felt it too, though Bradley was too blinded by his own determination to assert power to notice. So he barked questions, pushing, prodding, asking where Darius was headed, what he was doing in this part of town, why he drove a car like this, questions laced with innuendo rather than legal relevance. And Darius answered each one with calm precision, never raising his voice, never stumbling. Though his eyes, sharp, intelligent, observant, watched Bradley the way a chess master studies an over-ajar opponent. And the longer the interaction dragged, the more Bradley's temper simmered, because he couldn't break through that calm exterior, couldn't shake this man into the nervous submission he craved, so finally he raised his voice, pushing Darius against the car in a show of aggression that drew gasps from the small crowd gathering nearby, their phones out, cameras rolling. And even then, Darius didn't resist, didn't flinch, only said quietly, "You're making a mistake." And something in his tone wasn't fear, but warning. Subtle gravity that made Bradley hesitate. But before he could process it, a second squad car rolled up, an officer inside waving urgently, calling out, "Harkins, stand down, that's Chief Cole." But the words came too late, because Bradley had already tightened his grip, already crossed the line. And in that moment, as Darius finally let the mask slip just enough to let his true authority shine through, his voice booming with the steel of command as he declared, "I am Darius Cole, head of internal affairs for the Easton Police Department, and you will remove your hands from me immediately." The entire street seemed to fall silent, the weight of those words crashing down not just on Bradley, but on every witness, every camera, every officer who had ever feared internal affairs. More than criminals themselves, because this wasn't just a traffic stop anymore. This was the beginning of a reckoning.